ABC General Hospital Spoilers reveal that Britt felt the terror settle into her bones the moment she pieced together the truth about Anna's disappearance, a truth she had never intended to uncover but now could no longer escape, as every hallway in Wyndemere seemed to echo with a warning she could not silence. The revelation that Anna was being held somewhere within these walls turned Britt's already fragile sense of control into something brittle and dangerous, as though the slightest breath might shatter whatever remained of her composure. For weeks she had tried to convince herself that her situation, though suffocating, was manageable if she simply followed Cullum's orders and stayed quiet. But this new development rearranged everything she thought she understood, forcing her into a reality where each step she took felt monitored, each thought felt constrained, and every breath felt borrowed. She could no longer pretend that her cooperation was enough to keep her safe. Not when the evidence of Anna's captivity proved that Cullum and his network were operating far beyond anything she had imagined, and that the stakes were far more sinister than a forced research assignment or a threat whispered through clenched teeth. The shift was subtle at first, shadows that lingered too long in corners, guards who appeared in places they shouldn't. Sidwell's sudden refusal to meet her eyes, but Britt felt it all, felt the tightening of the net around her, felt the weight of an unseen hand steering her toward a future she had never agreed to. This was not merely a complication, it was an escalation. One that showed her how deeply entrenched she now was in an operation that thrived on fear, silence, and absolute obedience. The knowledge that Anna was suffering somewhere nearby began to claw at Britt's mind, becoming an intrusive rhythm she could not push away. No matter how fiercely she tried to bury it under logic or denial, she imagined Anna in a cold room, restrained, confused, subjected to psychological torture meant to crush her sense of self. Perhaps even being manipulated into believing that old ghosts like Caesar Faison still lived in the darkness. That image alone was enough to ignite a tremor beneath Britt's ribs, a kind of primal dread that blended with guilt, outrage, and a helplessness she despised. It was this emotional storm that marked the beginning of the adjustments Cullum had issued his chilling term for the new restrictions imposed upon her. Restrictions that made it painfully evident that he suspected she knew more than she should. He didn't accuse her directly, but he tightened her schedule, reassigned guards to shadow her movements, limited her access to equipment she had routinely used, and spoke to her with a measured coldness that suggested he was waiting, watching, assessing whether she was still useful or becoming a liability. Britt hated the way her pulse spiked every time Cullum entered a room, hated the way she had begun to question even her smallest thoughts as though they too might betray her. But she could not deny that fear sharpened her awareness in ways she had never experienced before. She was trapped in a horrific balance between obedience and survival, and every instinct screamed that one wrong move would collapse that balance completely. Yet what terrified Britt more than Cullum's tactics was the creeping realization that she was beginning to internalize the oppression around her. The more she tried to push away the anxiety, the more it seemed to anchor itself in her, turning into a quiet, relentless presence that followed her like a shadow. She found herself listening for footsteps, even when she was alone, analyzing the pitch of every electronic hum in the lab, checking over her shoulder on reflex, subtle signs that the fear was no longer external but had become a psychological imprint, a new obsession forming in the darkest corners of her mind. This obsession wasn't just about escaping anymore, it was about understanding the scale of the threat, deciphering how these men operated, predicting just how far they were willing to go with Anna and with her. Each time she thought about speaking up, warning someone, or even attempting to interfere, she was struck by the memory of Cullum's voice. That cold certainty reminding her that he held power not just over her life, but over the lives of the people she cared about. That was the truest prison of all the knowledge that her silence was the only barrier between her and catastrophe. Britt's world narrowed into a suffocating maze of calculated movements and hidden terror. And with each passing hour, she could feel herself being reshaped by forces she could not fight head-on. The Wyndemere she once viewed as merely oppressive now felt predatory, as if its walls absorbed every secret and fed off every fear. The revelation about Anna had not only exposed the brutality of what was happening behind closed doors, it had exposed Britt's own vulnerability, forcing her to confront the fact that she was no longer a reluctant participant but a trapped witness to horrors she could neither ignore nor escape. That awareness became an obsession she could not silence, a haunting that followed her through every corridor, every sleepless night, every moment she spent pretending to comply. And in that rising pressure, in that relentless tightening of the world around her, Britt began to sense that she was approaching a breaking point, one that would eventually force her to choose between survival and conscience, between fear and action, between her silence and Anna's fate. Britt could feel the fear burrowing deeper into her as each hour passed inside Wyndemere, a fear that no longer felt like a passing reaction but a permanent imprint on her nerves, tightening around her like a vice. She had already known that working under Cullum meant surrendering a measure of control, But she had never anticipated the scale of danger unfolding around her, or the shock that now reshaped every thought. She tried to hold steady. The revelation that Anna was being held prisoner within the same estate where Britt was forced to work had detonated. Something inside her, a realization so abrupt and violent that it unsettled even the survival instincts she had relied on for so long. Britt had imagined threats before, but nothing had prepared her for the possibility that she might be the next target of whatever sinister plan Cullum and his accomplices were executing behind locked doors and coded alarms. The danger surrounding her had transformed from abstract warnings to concrete, suffocating reality. She was now navigating a world where each glance from a guard seemed to hold a hidden message, where every closed door hinted at secrets she was never meant to know, and where her own footsteps sounded like betrayals echoing beneath the ceilings of Wyndemere. Cullum's new measures, his tightened supervision, the abrupt restrictions on her movement, the calculated coldness in his instructions were proof that he sensed her growing instability. And yet, what he interpreted as weakness was actually something far more dangerous. Britt was no longer afraid in the passive, compliant way he expected. Her fear had evolved into something sharper, something calculating, something that demanded action rather than obedience. The shock of discovering Anna's captivity had not paralyzed Britt, it had awakened her. And in that awakening, she realized that the control Cullum believed he still had over her was slipping not overtly, but internally, where her mind had begun forming the outline of a plan she could not yet articulate, but felt burning beneath her ribs, like a second heartbeat. She understood now that merely surviving was not enough. She needed to fight back to disrupt whatever twisted scheme Cullum had devised, and most importantly, to find a way to extract Anna from the nightmare unfolding within Wyndemere's walls. Britt's terror remained real, but it had fused with determination, shaping a new, dangerous clarity she had not possessed before. She could no longer deny that something monumental had shifted inside her. This change was not just emotional but strategic, a recalibration of her perception and purpose. For so long she had been moving under Cullum's shadow, adjusting her decisions according to his demands, trying to maintain the illusion of compliance to protect those she loved. But now the focus of her calculations had changed. Each order he issued, each threat he revived, each moment he assumed she would crumble, only fueled the private rebellion forming behind her composed facade. She was still cautious, she had to be, but her caution had acquired direction. Britt was observing more carefully, listening more intently, mapping every weakness, every habit, every entry point, every guard rotation. These were no longer signs of self-preservation, they were the first steps of resistance. With every new adjustment Cullum forced upon her, Britt refined her emerging plan. She pretended to accept the increased surveillance, the shortened lab hours, the confiscated access cards, but beneath the surface she was already anticipating how these limitations could be turned against him. The fear she carried was now layered with purpose, a dangerous blend that made her sharper, quicker, and far less predictable. She knew Cullum believed he still controlled the chessboard, but Britt had begun rearranging pieces he didn't even realize were in motion. The thought of Anna suffering somewhere nearby only intensified her resolve. Britt imagined the confusion, the psychological torment, the methods Cullum's team could be using to break Anna down. Each imagined scenario struck her with a fresh wave of dread, but instead of collapsing under it, Britt allowed the fear to sharpen her intentions. Saving Anna was no longer an optional act of compassion, it had become the catalyst for Britt's transformation. It was the proof that she could reclaim power in a place designed to strip it away. And with every detail she uncovered about Anna's condition, Britt's strategy grew clearer, bolder, more defined. Cullum, however, sensed something shifting even if he could not yet name it. There were moments when he watched Britt with a scrutiny that felt colder than usual. Moments when his eyes narrowed as if trying to decode the subtle change in her energy. What unsettled him most was the silence, Britt's quiet compliance that no longer carried fear the way it once had. She moved with too much control, responded with too much calculation. Something about her had changed, and the uncertainty of that change unnerved him. He had expected Britt to unravel under pressure, but instead she had become unreadable. Her expression composed yet charged with something he could not pin down. And this was the moment Britt had been waiting for, the moment Cullum realized his dominance was no longer absolute. The moment he recognized a threat in someone he had underestimated from the beginning. Her shift was subtle enough to avoid immediate suspicion, yet profound enough to destabilize his confidence. Britt was no longer the frightened doctor forced into compliance. She was a strategist, a threat in disguise, a woman with a plan that lived just beneath the surface of her stillness. And for the first time since Wyndemere had swallowed her whole, Cullum felt something crack in his certainty because Britt Westbourne was no longer predictable. And unpredictable people were the ones most capable of dismantling everything he had built. Jason had always known that something was wrong with Wyndemere, its silence, its sealed corridors. Its shifting shadows had never sat right with him, but the new information he uncovered shattered any lingering doubt, and forced him to confront a truth far darker than anything he had anticipated. The adjustments in Britt's behavior, the tension embedded in her voice, The fear she tried to hide beneath polite sentences, all of it formed a pattern he could no longer ignore. And when he finally pieced together the fragments she had dropped, whether intentionally or by accident, Jason realized that Britt was not merely under pressure. She was trapped inside something calculated, something violent, something that had grown beyond her ability to escape. Worse still, Anna was part of it. The moment Jason confirmed that Anna was being held inside Wyndemere, restrained, isolated, subjected to psychological manipulation designed to break her, everything around him shifted. The world seemed to narrow into a single, unbreakable line of purpose. And the calm that had always defined him hardened into something colder, sharper, unstoppable. This was no longer a situation he could outsmart quietly or solve with negotiation. It was a war waiting to ignite, and Jason knew he was already standing at the edge of it. The shock of discovering that both Britt and Anna were in immediate danger triggered a transformation inside him. A recalibration of instinct that had no room for hesitation. He replayed every moment he had shared with Britt since the night she confessed. Analyzed every detail she had avoided too carefully, every tremor in her breath when she mentioned Cullum, every shadow that crossed her eyes when she spoke of returning to Wyndemere. Jason had thought she was scared of consequences. He hadn't realized she was terrified of something far worse, something capable of destroying her from the inside before anyone even realized she was gone. Britt had been trying to protect him by withholding the full extent of her situation, but her silence had become the very key that unlocked Jason's understanding. The new adjustments Cullum forced upon her were not simply punishments or attempts to tighten his control. They were signs that he sensed her resistance, signs that he was preparing for something final, irreversible, and Jason knew that if he didn't move soon, Britt's time would run out. The calculations forming in Jason's mind unfolded with precision, mapping the estate, predicting guard rotations, analyzing the storm patterns. Wyndemere was notorious for exploiting. This was the kind of operation he was built for. The kind that demanded absolute focus and the ability to move through danger with silent brutality. But beneath the tactical clarity was something more emotional, something raw and volatile. Jason wasn't simply strategizing. He was preparing to rip Britt and Anna out of a nightmare designed to consume them. His determination was heightened by the realization that Cullum was escalating, shifting from threats to irreversible actions. Jason could sense the urgency, the tightening of the noose. The way every hour Britt remained inside that labyrinth of secrets brought her closer to breaking under the weight of fear she could not escape. He hated the thought of her facing that alone. Hated knowing she had been trying to protect him instead of asking for help. And that anger fueled him, sharpened him, turned him into a force that Wyndemere would not see coming. Each passing moment added another layer to Jason's plan, but also another layer to the emotional storm building inside him. He had always been steady, even under fire, even when facing impossible odds, but this situation felt different. Personal in a way he could not fully articulate. It was not just about rescuing allies. It was about reclaiming people who mattered, people whose suffering had crossed a line he could not ignore. The revelation that Anna was being psychologically tortured, manipulated into believing in ghosts from her past, pushed Jason to the edge of fury. The idea of Britt walking through Wyndemere each day pretending to comply while fear hollowed her out from the inside made his jaw tighten until it hurt. And the knowledge that Cullum believed he could control them indefinitely sparked something dangerous in Jason, a cold certainty that could only be quenched by action. He began preparing in secret, gathering resources, memorizing access points, studying the estate's architecture with a precision that bordered on obsession. Every door, every vent, every blind corner became part of the mental map he constructed, a path toward infiltration that no amount of surveillance could block. Jason knew Wyndemere thrived on illusions of invincibility, on the myth that its darkness could swallow anyone whole. But he also knew that illusions were easy to break once you understood where the seams were. And Jason had already found the seams, the weaknesses Cullum didn't account for. The vulnerabilities that would allow him to slip in unnoticed and dismantle the operation from within. What Cullum failed to anticipate was the depth of Jason's resolve. He didn't understand that Jason's loyalty was absolute, that once he decided to protect someone, he became unbreakable, immovable, terrifying in his precision. Britt had tried to shield Jason from the truth, but all she had done was awaken a force that no threat could contain. The moment Jason set his target on Wyndemere, the attack became inevitable. It was no longer a question of whether he would go in, it was only a question of how many of Cullum's men would fail to stop him. As Jason completed the final adjustments to his plan, a chilling stillness washed over him, an almost prophetic awareness that what he was about to do would change everything. This was not a rescue. It was an assault on the heart of a conspiracy that had thrived in the shadows for too long. Wyndemere had trapped Britt and Anna, reshaped them with fear and manipulation. But Jason was about to break that cycle, shatter the illusion of control, and pull them back into the world before the darkness finished consuming them. And somewhere inside that cursed estate, as Britt fought silently against her dread and Anna struggled to hold on to her sanity, an unseen shift began to pulse through the walls, because Jason was coming, and the moment he stepped onto Spoon Island, Wyndemere would no longer be the predator. It would become the battlefield